All right. All right. I'm just waiting here for my co-host Mia Schachter to join us on Consent Countdown episode 3. We have an exciting episode coming to you. All right. Thank you all for your patience. They're joining now. I hear them, I think.
Do you see me? Okay. Hello. Oh,
All
my
right,
mom is here.
are we gonna talk about Tom Brady's retirement?
Fuck yeah, we are. Yeah, my mom's here. Hi, Mom. I don't have my blazer. I'm out and about, but I do have a red sweater that matches this newsroom.
This is perfect.
Was the best I could do.
This is why people come here for the outfits, for the fashion and the sports.
For the fashion and Tom Brady news. Yeah, okay. We don't need to talk about Tom Brady. We can cover other things. Though, I mean, Tom Brady is an interesting figure, but I'm not really up on the latest.
Me neither. So we'll just go ahead with our consent convos.
Yes, and today specifically, we wanted to talk about different definitions of consent in different realms, right?
Yeah. Because no one has an agreed upon definition.
Right, and I think there's a lot of different uses for it that all get put under the same definition, even though it's being used in very different ways, right?
Yeah, which definitions come up for you the most, or which realms come up for you the most?
Well, I think the most common one, whether or not people are using it in a legal context, they're using the legal definition, which is conflated with permission. So it's like, do I have consent to record this? Yes or no, or like, signing a consent form. And that is really saying, do I have your permission to do something? Which is not how you and I talk about consent when we're talking about perhaps these other realms where we've been talking about how to describe these other forms of consent, something like maybe ethical consent. There's different types. So there's like consent in the realm of like physical stuff, so like body related consent, and that would probably, sexual consent would like fall under that category, I would say, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's ethical consent, which we've talked about. I think there's interpersonal consent. I think these are probably like overlapping circles, which just made me think of a great diagram that I could make.
You're on a Venn diagram kick.
I am. I know. That's like a big Venn diagram. Many circles. So yeah, the legal definition, and it's interesting. I just posted a question on my stories that was like, what is something about consent that scares you? And the majority of the answers were about two things. One was the majority of the answers were conflating consent with permission. So it was like that I'll give it and then change my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And then the second thing that came up most was like fear around saying no, whether that was like retaliation.
Blessings.
Thanks. Yeah, like fear around retaliation or disappointing someone, all these different fears that come up around specifically saying no. So that was really striking to me. And I think it ties into this conversation because I think that a lot of those fears can kind of be assuaged when you think about consent as a practice as opposed to something that you give and receive.
Right.
Sarah, do you have
any thoughts on that? Yeah. I want to make sure that it's clear that we are not, or at least I am not intending to minimize legal consent in terms of it has a function in our society.
Absolutely.
That's why I figured you're on the same page. It is important that before a doctor does something to me that I've given consent.
Informed consent. Yeah.
Right. Informed consent. And it's also important that they are practicing ethical consent while doing whatever they're doing to me, with me, in terms of medical procedures.
Absolutely. And I think well, I just want to give like concrete examples of what those two things look like and how they're different. So the legal consent would be like the doctor has given you a form about like what to expect in a procedure, or that they've given you all the information you need about a prescription that they've given you. I have definitely been on prescription medications and not been given all the information up front, and then been like, I don't know what's going on with my stomach, or like, why am I having nightmares, and then like Googled it and been like, wow, these are like in the side effects of this thing, and nobody told me. So that's the legal consent when you go to the doctor, I agree to blah, 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 whatever treatment. And then the ongoing consent, the practicing of consent would be like, for example, at the gynecologist, I'm going to insert my fingers and I'm going to feel your ovaries, right? It might be a little cold. You're going to feel some pressure. That's what we mean when we're talking about ongoing consent and the practice of consent. So those are two related but distinct things.
And even and within that, if the doctor says they're going to insert their fingers now, and you say, I'm not comfortable with that, they will stop, or they should stop.
Right.
I don't use should often, but they should stop. That doesn't mean that you can now sue them for the fact that they were going to start doing that. Mm-hmm. And again, that's the legal realm. Neither of us deal in that, but it is to say that even in legal consent context, there is still like flexibility, and there is still a practice. And I think that's what makes sexual consent so difficult, is that there are legalities around it. Mm-hmm. And you can't write it all out. That's not how it works.
Right.
You can't.
Right.
You
don't know what's gonna come up. I mean, this is why, like, when people ask me, how do I know what my boundaries are? I'm like, you can't. You can know what they feel like, so that when you hit one, you go, oh, hey, that's a boundary I didn't know I had. But you cannot predict the future. A lot of my job, like on TV sets, is to attempt to do my best to eliminate surprises for actors, so they're not shocked by anything on the day that we're shooting. But I cannot fully eliminate surprises because I cannot predict the future, and things that I might even think like, oh, I would want to know about this. There might be many other things that this actor might want to know that I wouldn't know that they would want to know, So then I have to be able to navigate that in the moment as it comes up. And in a sexual scenario, like, especially if you've like never been intimate with someone before, this is the first time, like, you don't know how each other likes to be touched. There has to be an ongoing practice of like, how is this? Can you show me how you like to be touched here? Like, is this the right pressure? Like, those conversations are part of the ongoing consent. And what I wanted to say about the legal consent thing is that you can agree to something legally, but that doesn't mean that you are legally bound to following through in certain situations. There are certain situations in which that is like the purpose of a contract. However, that's not the kind of consent that you and I are talking about. And I would say like a lot of contracts people can get out of. You know, like you have to be, in order for the consent that you and I are talking about, in order for ethical consent to be taking place, there has to be room for people to change their mind. And that's true on TV sets. We have what's called a rider, which is the agreement per scene to like what the actor has agreed to do. So like whether it's to show my chest or to show my butt or agree to simulate a particular sex act, in the rider it'll say, you know, the player agrees to full frontal nudity, for example. But the actor can change their mind. And I remind actors of this all the time, because just because you said that you would do it and you signed the document, that is as much as we can do. It's not everything that we have to do. So if you change your mind and you're no longer comfortable, that is well within your rights.
One of my probably only response to was that consensual?
Yeah.
Or was that consent is, well, how were you practicing consent?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you can only define your consent experience by one action that you took,
right,
or by one action that they took, then that, again, not legally, but that probably wasn't, you probably weren't in consent. Because
yes,
it's like, Sunny, I'm forgetting their last name, but they're a kink educator. Sunny I feel like saying Megatron, and I just don't know that that's right.
Oh,
but
no, I think that's right.
That's right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sunny Megatron. Okay, cool, amazing. Talks about the Swiss cheese model of consent.
Yes.
Where
yes.
I love consent nerds. Where it's like, let's say you do forget to ask because you're running on like autopilot and you forget to ask. Okay, cool. But then do you pay attention to their body language? If you do, then you're not going to get through the whole Swiss cheese. You're going to hit a Megatron. Haha, we were right. Okay. Thank you, Sammy. You're going to hit like you're going to not go through all the way. Even if you don't pay attention to body language, you forget to ask, but then you check in. There you go. You're showing that there is a practice there, and you're not just like, did you get consent in this one moment? And so if you want to make sure you're legally practicing consent, it's not about the yes, it's about the multiple steps that you are taking. And if you are taking multiple steps, can't speak to this legally, but I truly believe it will be difficult for someone to find you to be breaking the law.
Right.
Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think so. I think so. I was gonna say, you know, I made this reel about like stuff that's been coming up for me around Chris Noth's, like the accusations against him and the way that he was like, all the sex was consensual, and the way that Chris Noth, Mr. Big from Sex and the City.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So, or Noth, I don't know. So like he says that all the sex that he had with these people was consensual, and what I keep seeing over and over again is that I believe that people are saying this was consensual because they never heard a no, and that is not enough. And to your point, you know, the question then is, how were you practicing consent? Was consent taking place? And the answer clearly was no. Like both of the women had these like identical stories of the way that he fucked them in front of a mirror, like in the position, like it was like really consistent. And he's like, it was consensual. And I'm like, well, did you ask them if they were enjoying themselves? Like, did you check in with them? Did you ask them literally anything? And I think that there is sort of this ongoing idea of consent where it's like, it's consensual if no one says no. Or like if someone says no and you stop, that's consensual, you know?
Right.
Like, and that's ignoring all of those nonverbal cues, like how someone says what they say, you know, their tone of voice, their body language, their facial expression, like blah, blah, blah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I literally wrote a song about it.
Max Silver wrote a song?
Max Silver wrote a song called I Said No, about all the nonverbal ways that people say no.
I love that. I have to go listen to that song. Yeah. What's coming up for you?
Well, I'm thinking about our thread of like the different kinds of consent, and also like, you know, there's a question to be asked, I think, like, does it make sense to try to differentiate kinds of consent, or does it make sense to sort of ask the word consent to hold all these different realms?
I think it is fair to do that, and we I think it can be an umbrella, and also we need to be better at distinguishing our language.
Yeah.
So rather than like an accusation of like, I didn't consent, because that can feel really harsh and just put up someone's defenses also.
Yeah.
If I didn't feel comfortable when you did that, or like that, you know, I wasn't okay with that, or I need more space next time, or like I need you to wait for a more a real yes, like that word specifically.
Or can you wait for me to invite you, or can you wait for me to initiate, or those kinds of things?
Right, as opposed to, I don't want to ask for consent, I gave consent, that wasn't consent. So I think it can fall under that big umbrella as long as we're using different terms in the field.
Right. It was interesting to me that so many of the responses that I got, like from my own followers, you know, I talk about like not conflating permission, consent and permission. And I talk about, you know, ongoing and the practice of it and receiving a no and all this stuff. And so I was really surprised that it's still, you know, not like y'all aren't paying attention, but sort of like, it's so ingrained. Like it's so
So
ingrained in our
ingrained.
minds that like, no matter how much we talk about it, it's not, it's very challenging to undo the way that we've learned it. And I think it goes hand in hand with stuff like, you know, these like buzzy things like, no means no, and you know, anything other than an enthusiastic yes is a no. It's like people, I think I understand the urge to seek these like clear ways to ensure that you are not hurting other people. And I think that, you know, I've am always like moving in the direction of sort of coming to terms with the fact that being in relationship with other people means that I will hurt people. And so I would prefer to spend my time and energy working on, you know, my process of repair and my ability to apologize and my ability to take feedback and my ability, you know what I mean? Like, I would rather put my energy into feeling confident in my ability to do those things than walking around on eggshells being like, I just don't want to hurt anybody, because anything that I say or do to express myself, I run the risk of crossing someone's boundary or doing something that they don't like, or, you know, like that's just part of being in relationship with other people and part of being a human being.
Right. It's also, it's like that when you think of like the bad guy, good guy, or, you know, bad human, good human dichotomy, you can't exist. You lose. You can't win. You either call yourself a good guy, and I mean guy is human in this term. You like call yourself a good human and you mess up but say, I'm not fallible because I'm good, or you don't try to do better because you're just bad, you ruin everything. And that's
Right.
just not true. And so I think there's this idea that if you like violate consent, you are bad, and like that's one of the worst things you can do. But when we think of consent as not just the opposite of sexual assault, then it's violating consent isn't the worst thing. What were you gonna say?
No, well, I was gonna say that every time that I've posted, like I do post about that, and I post about how, you know, I have violated consent, and you have violated consent, and we have all violated consent, whether or not we're aware of it, because often people don't tell us when we've done something that they don't like or that they're not comfortable with, and getting used to that fact is like a big part of being in the practice. But when I post about that, people accuse me of being a rape apologist, being like, so you're saying that like if you sexually assault someone, you're not a bad person. And like, I actually am also saying that because I don't believe in good people and bad people. So,
Yeah.
and I believe in repair, and I believe in restorative justice, and I believe that there's like an immense lack of education around consent and sex and pleasure and so on. And so if someone does commit sexual assault, I don't believe that they are beyond healing and repair. So yes, I kind of am saying that. I'm not suggesting that people go out and do stuff like that, but I'm suggesting that we figure out how to rehabilitate people as opposed to saying you are bad now. I mean, that's a carceral mindset. You know, you can't really call yourself an abolitionist and say like, if you do X, you are a bad person, period.
Right. Also, we set people up to fail with our sex education.
Absolutely.
So like that doesn't mean that person doesn't need to be individually accountable to the person, but we can't also say like you're bad because they did not come out of the womb a perpetrator. Somehow this world, the education they got, the community they were surrounded by, and by community I mean like I should say systems, not community. The systems they were surrounded by impacted the choices they made. So we got to take that into account, because if we're saying they're bad, that means we're bad too because we produced them.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, I'm thinking about the way that like it can be very challenging, especially when you are the person harmed. I attempt to not to like, you know, blame the system, not the individual. And yet accountability is really important. Like individual accountability is really important to like relationship repair. So, you know, it's always kind of like a both thing.
Absolutely. I also think what's really interesting about like this idea of violating consent on like smaller scales and other than sexual assault is that like, oh no, sorry.
You froze for a second.
My battery did a thing. Hopefully we last. I was going to say a thing about consent, which is so not helpful in determining what I was going to say. Oh, right. Bear with me. That it is okay. It's hard to phrase this, but it is okay sometimes, or it makes sense sometimes to violate consent. And I'm not even talking about like life or death circumstances. I'm talking about my brother wants to borrow something from my room. I'm in the kitchen in a meeting. He needs to borrow it to do this thing that he promised his friend he would do that's really important to him. I told him last time that he could borrow it. Does that mean that this time he can? Not necessarily, but is it reasonable that he is not going to interrupt me to ask me if he can do it and not just decide, oh, well, I can't ask her, so I'm not going to take it? No, it is totally reasonable for him to not ask and do the thing. And the outcome of that might be that I'm annoyed that he took the thing, that he took my laptop or he took my whatever, but there were other values at stake, like a promise he made to his friend. I was in a meeting. I didn't want to be interrupted. We could have figured it out before. Now we know for next time there's accountability. And so it's, yes, we all violate consent. And sometimes it's totally reasonable that we do, even if it's not a life or death circumstances. The whole thing is, what are you taking into consideration? What context? What are the stakes? What are, you know, past conversations you've had? And what are you doing in the times that you get it wrong?
Right. And then how do you like set up systems moving forward to sort of prevent it from happening again? I'm thinking, you know, I just want to clarify for anyone who wants an example of like of a life or death situation where like, for example, you know, you might be sort of violating someone's personal boundaries around their bodily autonomy when you pounce on them to get them out of the way of like the car that's about to hit them. You know, like that, you could look at that as a consent violation. I mean, there's people who like get administered Narcan because they're overdosing and they get pissed at the person for ruining their high. And that person is like, well, I saved your life. So yeah, there are
Yeah,
moments where it's actually really
a really good example.
important.
Right.
Crazy.
And times where there's just competing values and you make a
Right.
choice, but you have to make that choice also with the understanding that you're not necessarily making the right choice. This comes up
Right.
for me, this is how I've landed on the idea of a brit milah, or a circumcision for a Jewish baby with penis, which
Mm-hmm.
is that I feel I have a lot of opinions, but I think at the end of the day, if you are choosing as a parent to do this, not for health and safety reasons, but for religious reasons, because I do believe in like a right to
Yep.
practice religion, but for me, the bodily autonomy thing is huge. I need you to realize you are violating bodily autonomy and to be
Yes.
prepared for your child to say, I didn't want that. And for you to not get defensive, but to say, I made a decision based on this, and that. I'm sorry that I made the wrong decision. If you
Right, and
can
take
do
some
that,
accountability around that. Mm-hmm.
right? If you can do that, I don't love the idea of circumcision for a Jewish baby, like, but I get that my values are different. But if you
Right.
are going to
Right.
say that this is the right choice for them and it's not a violation of their bodily autonomy because it's their religion, no, it's your religion, honey. Like,
Yes.
it's not their religion. If you're going to be defensive
Yeah.
about it when they
They
say I
are.
didn't want, and say, well, you're a Jew, so you have to, like, no, that's not autonomy. Sometimes we don't know
Yeah.
what the right choice is. Right, exactly. So
Right.
sometimes we don't know what the right choice is. And as long as you're doing it with an understanding that you're not sure and you're making a choice with the information available and that can be available and taking your values into consideration, okay, okay.
Mm-hmm. There was something that you said in there that made me. Oh, I wish I'd written it down. I don't remember. It was something right before you brought up the circumcision.
That if you know that you're not making necessarily a good choice, like you don't have all the information. I don't know.
I don't remember.
Cool.
So, in terms of this idea of like having different kinds of consent, I guess I'm wondering then, like, how does that affect how we teach it?
Well, I think this is a good opportunity for you to talk about the kind of consent you teach,
Oh
because I
yeah,
think
yeah, and then for
most
you to talk
people,
about.
well, I think also most people understand, are more familiar with the way I teach consent, which is
About the
majority about the
body.
body. Yeah, about the body.
Right.
Which is
Okay.
the closer, which again, within that is sexual consent. But the way
Right.
that you teach consent, it does include the body, but it focuses not necessarily on it.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about this and try to describe it because didn't I didn't land on the way that I teach consent with any forethought. Like it wasn't like I was like, how do I want to teach this? It was like, how is this working for me? And like, how is this affecting me? And like, what do I want to teach people? And I thought that I was just teaching them stuff that I learned, but it does seem very clear now that I'm approaching it much more from a place of like, knowing myself, like getting to know myself first, and practicing consent with myself, so that I can then extend that outward. So I mostly teach consent. I think I talk mostly about interpersonal consent, so like the ways that I'm relating to other people, but it doesn't necessarily have to do with touch. And you know what, Sarah? I've never thought about this, but I wonder if part of the reason why it doesn't have much to do with touch is because I started doing it at the beginning of COVID.
It's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder how much that has affected the way that I think about this stuff. So I have a post that I'm going to be making today, that I posted earlier but took down. That's a tree, and it's a consent tree, and then every branch is like a different sort of offshoot of consent, or like thing that is related to consent that people don't necessarily think about as what.
I made a mind map.
I almost made a mind map, and then I put it into a tree.
I made a mind map.
Can you send it to me?
It's great. It's a lot. I can definitely send it to you. It's overwhelming.
Well, so I'll tell you what's
and needs to be updated. But yeah. Okay, yeah. So you made a consent tree. I'm so excited for this.
What's on my tree that I think like sort of explains like my approach to this stuff is that it's things like burnout, creativity, self-expression, body awareness, mindfulness, attachment theory, polyvagal theory, stress, trauma, like all these things that I think that we're all a codependency, like, all these things that have in my view, like consent at their core, whether or not people are really thinking about how consent plays into like, how does consent relate to attachment theory? Actually, like immensely, there's like a lot in there. How does consent relate to creativity? I could talk about that for hours, but like when you say the word consent, people usually are sort of like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Either we're talking about sex or you're telling me that I've done something wrong. People get very defensive. They hear it as an accusation, or they go like, I'm pretty good at that stuff, and I'm like, but do you know how much of like an incredible tool it would be for you to work on your art, through this lens of consent, and I think that that's a leap for a lot of people.
Yeah, and something's percolating, but it's not ready. It's not ready yet. But our mind maps look very different.
What's
definitely the case, or our trees, however you want to put it, our offshoots of consent. Yeah, mine are way more surface. It's I mean, my lens is psychology, so it is like the cognitive and social reasons for why we do certain things. It's more it's so funny that you said interpersonal consent, because I heard the words that I heard you say, like creativity, self-expression, to me are very personal. And I would call what I do interpersonal consent, and be more potentially, I would think you lean more on the personal consent kind of side.
Yeah, I'm thinking now about like personal consent and relational consent. Like in terms of attachment theory, trauma.
Right, those are right. I see those as as relational. It's hard to define how those differences.
Yeah, okay, my brain is like making diagrams and stuff. Wait, it says, can you give examples of what that would look like in terms of things mentioned in regards to your tree creativity? Yeah, okay. So creativity actually is like super wrapped up in attachment theory stuff, where when you feel safe, you can play and explore and try new things, and you can explore things that you're curious about, and fear failure less, because you know that you're going to be okay. So when it comes to creativity, my experience has been that through like deepening my consent practice, through allowing myself to be like, I'm not going to work on this project right now. I'll do this later. Or like waiting for a spark and sort of trusting in myself that spark will come, not berating myself, not pushing myself past my capacity, that fosters a really like nourishing and like fertilized environment for creativity to grow. Does that make sense to whoever asked that?
Made sense. Mostly. It doesn't make sense to me because it's complicated in terms of like, I have a basic understanding. But like, I would need to take your class to learn more.
Well, yeah, I think I'm gonna definitely be talking about that in the 4 week that's coming up. And you know, it was something that I didn't expect. It was a result, and I was like, what's going on? Like, I just want to be creative all the time, and I'm like, you know, I put out this EP and I started writing a book, and I was like, what's happening? You know, like, why is this happening? I felt like pretty blocked, or I've had really a lot of trouble with like motivation and starting things. And through working on consent with myself, that stuff just sort of started to come out of me. And it's funny that you say like your lens is psychology. As soon as you said that, I was like, whoa, my lens really is like all the stuff that I studied in college. I studied philosophy and neuroscience and visual art and theater. And I think that like a lot of the stuff that I do comes from like acting training. You know, like a lot of stuff around confidence is like, what does it feel like to have no stress in my body? Just like take a walk with no stress in it, like just noticing where you can release stress. Like that feels like an acting exercise to me. Or like, tell me how cool you are and like really believe it. You know, like, and then you have to really get on your own side that way. And that feels like, you know, some combo of like mindfulness, affirmations, and acting training.
One of the things that I wanted to also make sure that, or that I wanted to bring up on this episode of Consent Countdown was also the like meta fact that because consent can have so many meanings, often there will be interruptions in conversations about consent because you and the other person are talking about two different things, potentially.
Right.
And this is something that happens all the time in consent, where if I say, I want a massage, one person thinks that means like a rough sports massage, but I'm talking about like a sensual, like lighter massage. And so it's not that anyone did anything wrong. It's that we both didn't clarify. We both didn't communicate further. And so someone's gonna have to speak up, and like I would have to speak up and say that's not what I'm looking for, that's crossing my boundary. I'm gonna have to like be in this place. So I think that's something that's so interesting about this conversation about consent definitions, is that when you don't define your terms, you can have a breach in consent.
Right, because you're sort of talking past each other. You haven't agreed upon what it is that you're doing or what you're speaking about. There's a question in here. What are your insights on training facilitators to do consent programming, given that the culture of non-consent is so prevalent?
Should we not change things just because they're not good? No. I'm sorry, that was said a little roughly, but just because things need a lot of change doesn't mean that we shouldn't change them, is my opinion.
Yeah, I train educators to do what I do, and I think we're all combating cultures of non-consent in each of our communities and circles and lives. I think the way to combat culture of non-consent is through teaching more people about consent.
Right. That's like, since so many people are racist, should we just like not do anti-racism training?
Like, yeah, since racism is so prevalent. Yeah.
I realize there's like some mockery in the question, but like truly this is exactly it, is that people think it's such a big deal. It's such a big problem, pervasive problem. Does it even make a difference? And the answer is yes, it does make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, even if it makes a difference in one person, I think it makes a difference. 100%. I also, like, part of the reason why I managed to get out of bed in the morning is because I do what I do, and I watch it change the people around me, and I watch them change the people around them, and I watch this stuff like spread through communities and literally change people's lives. I've also been thinking about the way, because I'm in this somatic attachment healing therapy program, and I've been thinking about the way that I totally just lost my train of thought. I got distracted by something and then I completely forgot what I was saying. Something about the attachment therapy. Oh yeah, I remember. That consent itself, like having a consent practice, building a consent practice is repair work. It is medicine. It is healing to do that.
Yeah.
Like literally practicing saying no to people in like a controlled environment is healing work. Like
Also,
that tells your nervous system, I am safe right now. And that is part of the repair, both between you and yourself, so that you trust yourself, and part of the repair work between you and other people.
I'm also realizing that there's a possibility that we misread the question. If this person is talking about mainstream consent, I have a different answer. If they are talking about because of the pervasive culture of non-consent, does it make sense to train consent educators who will teach like the Fry's model, for example? I don't know if that's what their question means, but I have a different answer if that's where they're coming from. That makes sense?
I'm not sure. Can you say that again?
Like, there are consent educators, like Sunny Megatron, you, me, who are kind of in the consent space. We're differently, and we get called rape apologists and things like that. And then there are consent educators that are teaching things like yes means yes and Fry's. Now,
right.
If the question is, should we continue to train people to teach Fry's and yes means yes? I have a slightly different answer, which is that legal consent is still important to understand and the scope of that, but we should not be calling that consent education. That is legal consent education. That is information about legal consent. It's not even education. It's just like, it's facts. It's like, there's no processing or critical thinking. Or I shouldn't say there's none, but there's very little. It's way more like, just like, here, let's give it a step-by-step 1, 2, 3. This is what you need to go and you're good to go. And
no,
that I don't think we should spend resources and time on that.
Yeah. You may not know this, but I do teach Fry's, and I just teach it in the context of like, here's what I think is wrong with Fry's, and here's where I think it doesn't, like, here's where I think it falls short and like doesn't accomplish what it's trying to accomplish. Here's where I think that, you know, it misunderstands blah, 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 blah. Because I think that that's really important. A lot of people learn Fry's and they're like, oh, cool. Like, I'll just like, you know, keep this acronym in my wallet.
And it's again important, but that's also not even legal consent. That's just like a halfway.
No, it's not.
So you feel like you've covered both and you really haven't. So I do think there needs to be education, just like there's information on like what your blood alcohol level can be when you drive. That's important information. We need to talk about age of consent and things like that. And we also can't pretend like Fry's is sufficient consent education. So in that case, I actually sometimes think that some people say like, well, some consent education is better than nothing. And I'm curious.
Not always.
I don't know that I agree, because I think it makes you feel like you've checked a box that you haven't checked. And
yes,
like, I know so many people who don't take who won't take your classes or other consent educators classes because they think they understand consent.
I know.
Because they understand Fry's.
Yes, and I run into this around gender stuff. I run into this around intimacy coordination. I made a post about it. Like, when I tell people that I teach consent or I do gender education or I'm an intimacy coordinator, very often people go, oh, like, I don't really need that. But like, that's really amazing that you do that. You know, I ran into this with my doctor. Like, he's never used my right pronouns. He's never told me his pronouns. I've never seen anyone in his office put their pronouns in their email signature. I've never seen, you know, he's misgendered me. He's talked to me as a woman. He's like, you know, he has no real awareness around gender whatsoever. And he was like, and I sent him the class that I'm teaching with my friend about pronouns for mental health practitioners, and he was like, I'm well aware of like the need to use people's pronouns, so I won't be taking this class, but I'll put it in the newsletter. What do you think? Like, here's the bio that I'll put in the newsletter. And he used she, her pronouns for me in my bio that he was going to email his newsletter mailing list.
The irony.
Or lack of irony. I mean, it's totally unironic. It's totally predictable. Yeah. And yeah, and then, you know, I wrote back to him and I was like, so this is a common reaction that I get, and like, here's why, and here's where I've heard it before, and I think you can see how absurd it is when you put it in this other context. Also, you got my pronouns wrong in the bio, and he hasn't written back. It's been like 3 or 4 weeks. He just hasn't written back to me. So, you know, that's the kind of stuff, like, it's often with consent, it's like people are like, oh, I'm pretty good at that. Like, and I'm like, pretty good at what? What do you think I'm talking about?
Yeah. Anytime anyone has consent in their like dating profile, I'm like, what?
Yeah, what do you mean
like,
by that?
I'm like to me, when I see someone just write consent, to me it means I'm checking a box.
Mm-hmm.
Or sometimes like I like to interpret it as like doesn't murder. Like, cool. Yeah. Like, you didn't commit a crime. Congratulations.
Right. Like, you know, whenever people put in their profile, like, communication and honesty are like really important to me, I'm like, that's a huge red flag. Like, huge red flag. It's also, it reminds me, Sarah, we've talked about this before, of like when people are like, I'm a totally regular person, and I'm like, how many people have you murdered?
100%.
That's if you need to tell me that you're an average person, there's something wrong. How many skeletons are in your closet?
I feel the same way about someone who has like, especially considering I live in Brooklyn. If I lived somewhere else, I would feel differently. But because I live in Brooklyn and that's my search radius, if I see people who have like BLM or like LGBTQ plus on their profile, I'm like, of course. Like, if I was in like bumblefuck, like Missouri, okay, fine. You're telling me that, like,
you're actually trying to differentiate yourself from
me. But like, yeah, I assume
bare minimum. Yeah, like that's the bare minimum.
That's the bare minimum. So yeah, when someone has consent in their profile, I'm just like, you know nothing.
Yeah, we're not gonna.
You were told you were supposed to do this. You saw someone else do this. You were told you were supposed to do this, and I am not going to be safe with you in a bedroom or elsewhere.
Yep. Yeah. Right. I personally don't feel the need to put in my profile, I'm good at consent.
So funny.
I value consent. Like, yeah. Also, I would never say I'm good at consent, because there's always more to get better at. Like, there's always more.
When I think about it like a practice, sometimes I'll relate it to like kindness, which is like, you can't see like
gratitude
or any of those like kind of intangible, ineffable. Is that the word? I'm so bad at words. I'm so bad at fancy words. But where it's like, just because you did a kind thing doesn't mean you are like, kindness comes with ease and you don't have to think about it. Like, no, you constantly need to think about kindness in order to be kind. And you also will do things that are not kind.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so to be, if someone said they were like, if someone says that they are, same thing, someone says that they are kind in their profile, I'm like, you're not kind.
Yeah.
Because you just think you are that, and it's a static trait, and that's just not true. It's a practice.
Right. I agree. Well said. I feel like we can wrap up there.
I think that's a good place to wrap up. I've gone into venting about dating apps, which is often where I
know. That's when we know we gotta cut it.
So to tag us out, Schacter, it's been a pleasure.
Caspar, as always, I'll talk to you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining. If you have
Goodbye.
any questions or comments, put them in the comments.
Bye, Mom.
Bye, Mom.
Yeah. Bye.